no, they call me the ghost of Rattlesnake Creek. Out here in Absaroka County, where the wind scours the truth right off a man, a nickname like that sticks. They say I'm a man who outlived his own heart. For 30 years, they haven't been wrong. My heart left the day Lena did, with our boy Jacob in tow. The silence she left behind, it became my only companion. The rhythm of my days measured in the creak of worn floorboards and the lonely howl of the Wyoming wind. I thought that silence was my punishment. I didn't realize it was a choice. My life was a fortress built of routine, coffee at dawn, mending the same fences, staring at the same unforgiving horizon of the Bighorn Mountains. I'm a proud man, stubborn, some would say. Methodical. It's how you survive out here, but that pride, it was a rust, eating away at the foundations of my life until the whole thing was ready to collapse at the slightest touch. And today, I felt that touch, not from the wind, but from a flicker of movement at the edge of my property, a small shape where nothing ever is. My first instinct was trespass, poachers maybe, or some lost tourist from the city, ignorant of property lines. I grabbed the old Winchester from its hooks by the door, the familiar weight a cold comfort in my hands. The rust I'd felt in my soul was nothing compared to the rust on this rifle, but I knew it would still bite. I moved slow, using the line of aspens as cover, my boots making no sound on the dry earth. The figure resolved itself. Not a deer, not a man, a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10, with a shock of dark hair just like Jacob's. He was kneeling, his small back to me, focused on something on the ground. The anger in my chest curdled into something else, something unfamiliar and tight. I lowered the rifle. "You're a long way from anywhere, son." My voice was a gravelly mess, torn from a throat used only for curses and silence. The boy jumped, scrambling back. His eyes were wide, the color of a stormy sky. He wasn't scared, not exactly. More defiant. He held up a small, wounded rabbit. "He's hurt," he said, his voice clear and steady. His legs broken. The directness of it, the simple, unvarnished truth, cut through 30 years of my own self-deception. Here was a problem that wasn't about the past or a broken heart. It was about a broken bone. It was something to be mended, methodical. That's what I was. I knelt down, the ache in my knees a sharp reminder of my age. "Let's see him," I grunted. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my hands reached out not to mend a fence, but to help something living. Will the ghost of Rattlesnake Creek finally mend his own heart? Subscribe to find out what happens next. We tell stories that dig deep into the human spirit. Don't miss the journey. He simply appeared at the edge of the old man's property, a small, silent boy named Cody, no older than 10. He clutched a worn leather journal to his chest like a shield, and his eyes held a tempest that made the storms over the mountains look like a spring shower. Before the old man could make sense of the apparition, Sheriff Miller's cruiser was kicking up dust on the road. A man whose ambition was outsized only by his arrogance, Miller wanted to ship the boy off to state services, just another piece of paperwork to file away. "Just a stray, old man. We'll handle it," he said with a dismissive wave, as if the boy were a lost calf. But the old man saw something in the child's defiant silence, a flicker of his own son, Jacob. In a moment that defied every rule he'd lived by for 3 decades, a voice that wasn't quite his rumbled out. "No." Miller stared, dumbfounded. "He stays with me." The words hung in the air, a shock to the sheriff, and an even bigger one to the old man himself. It was her first wrong choice, according to the town, or perhaps her first right one. Suddenly, the fortress she had built around herself had been breached. The boy would not speak, not a single word. He would flinch if she got too close, his whole body tensing like a rabbit that had caught the scent of a coyote. Her attempts at conversation were clumsy, dying in the quiet air of the kitchen. A question about hunger earned a nod. Another, about his interest in horses, only a shrug. Instead of talking, the boy drew. He filled page after page in his journal with pictures of the ranch, the horses, and the sky. It was his only language, and she was a poor student of it. She was about to retreat into her own silence for the evening when the sound of another engine made her stand. A dusty sedan pulled up behind Miller's cruiser, which had been left as if to mark territory. A woman emerged, and the way she moved with a purpose that was both weary and determined made it clear that the real fight was just beginning. Her name was Sarah, the boy's aunt and a social worker from the reservation. She possessed the same storm in her eyes as her nephew, but hers was a tempest weathered by time and knowing experience. When she looked at the man before her, she saw a relic, a stubborn old fool drowning in a sea of regret, incapable of offering anything of value to a wounded child. For him, she was an emotional mirror, her presence reflecting every harsh, unspoken judgment he held against himself. Her voice, low but steady, challenged him directly, questioning what a man who had chosen solitude for 3 decades could possibly offer a boy like Cody. Her motivation was pure and simple, the protection of her family. His, by contrast, was a tangled and complicated thing, a fool's errand to mend a broken past. He insisted the boy could stay, that he was safe, his voice rough with disuse. Though she did not believe his words for a second, something in his raw, unyielding stubbornness gave her pause. Reluctantly, she agreed to let the boy remain, but only for the time being, and on the strict condition of daily check-ins. As she departed, her gaze lingered on him, a potent mixture of pity and suspicion that stung far more than any display of outright anger ever could. A fragile and painstaking progress began to unfold between the man and the boy. He would impart his life's knowledge, teaching Cody how to interpret the subtle language of horses, the way a mare's mood could be deciphered from the mere flick of an ear. In this silent exchange, the boy offered his own form of communication. On the kitchen table, a drawing would appear. It was a portrait of the man, rendered in a child's honest hand, his face captured in a state of quiet neutrality, neither smiling nor scowling. Each drawing was a small, hard-won victory. The oppressive silence that had once filled the house began to transform. It was no longer a void of emptiness, but an atmosphere thick with expectation, a space waiting to be filled. One evening, deep into the night after the boy had gone to sleep, the man's eyes fell upon the journal left on the table. A fierce, internal battle ignited within him, his staunch, lifelong pride clashing with a desperate, gnawing curiosity. For 3 decades, he had lived by a rigid code, respecting every boundary and fortifying the walls around his heart. But on this night, driven by an impulse he couldn't contain, he broke his own most sacred rule. With trembling hands, he opened the book. The handwriting was not a child's scrawl. Instead, elegant script filled the pages with poetry. It was a woman's voice, speaking of a love so vast it was often misunderstood, celebrating the profound strength found not in resistance, but in the quiet power of yielding. As he read, it felt like he was trespassing on sacred ground, immersing himself in words that pulsed with a vibrant life he himself had abandoned long ago. The next day, an almost imperceptible shift occurred in the atmosphere of the house. Cody had spent the morning down by the creek, a place his grandfather hadn't set foot in for years, a territory of memory he deliberately avoided. When the boy returned for lunch, a smudge of dirt on his cheek, he left the journal lying open on the kitchen table. A fresh drawing adorned the page, and as his grandfather's gaze fell upon it, his heart seized in a cold, vice-like grip. The image was stark and achingly familiar, a gnarled ancient cottonwood, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers, reaching for a penciled sky. It wasn't just any tree, it was the cottonwood, the silent, stoic witness down by the creek. He could almost feel the rough bark under his fingertips, recall the soft laughter that had echoed there so long ago. It was a specific, sacred tree. The one where he and Lena had stolen away on their first anniversary, using his pocket knife to carve their initials inside a lopsided heart. A secret shared only between them and the old tree. He stumbled back from the table, his breath catching in his throat. He made his way to the porch, his hands shaking so violently he had to clutch the doorframe for support, the weathered wood grounding him in a terrifying present. How? The question was a silent scream in his mind, echoing in the hollow spaces of the quiet house. How could the boy know that? It was an impossible intrusion into a past he had so carefully locked away. The journal's elegant script belonged to a woman, that much was clear, but the drawings were now pulling memories from the deepest, most protected chambers of his soul, exposing them to the light with a brutal, startling clarity. This was no longer just a boy and his book. It had transcended that simple explanation. It felt like a deliberate message, a communication from another world, a ghost story unfolding not in whispers or shadows, but in graphite and ink, right there in the heart of his own house. The quiet tension that had settled over the isolated property finally broke a few days later, not with a storm, but with the slow, deliberate crunch of tires on gravel. It was more than just Sarah's familiar sedan. Following behind her was a dusty pickup and another car, a procession that spoke of serious purpose. From them emerged a delegation of Arapaho elders, their solemn presence transforming the mundane afternoon into a moment of profound significance. At their head was Sarah's grandfather, a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. His face was a living chronicle, each line etched by years of sun, sorrow, and profound wisdom. He moved not with the frailty of age, but with a deep-rooted certainty, his eyes holding the long memory of his people. The event did not go unnoticed. The small town of Ten Sleep held its breath, its residents becoming silhouettes in windows and shadows in doorways. Whispers spread like wildfire on a dry wind, a mix of apprehension and awe. Across the road, Sheriff Miller stood as a silent official witness. He leaned against the polished fender of his cruiser, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze sharp and unreadable as he absorbed every detail. But the elders had not come for a confrontation. They carried no weapons, offered no threats. Their purpose was something far more ancient and powerful. They had come to watch, to lend their collective weight to the moment, to bear witness. They gathered on the weathered planks of the porch, and their collective silence settled over the yard, a quiet force that resonated more deeply than any shouted word. The man who lived there felt himself become secondary, a mere fixture in a scene that was not truly about him. Sarah's grandfather's gaze swept past him without acknowledgement. It landed instead on the boy, Cody. Under the old man's steady look, a visible wave of relief washed over the boy. The tension that had held his shoulders rigid for days finally eased. For the first time, he seemed to find his footing. The elder's eyes then dropped to the worn leather journal clutched in Cody's hands, recognizing its significance instantly. A silent understanding passed, an acknowledgement of history and duty. The grandfather then turned his head slowly, his gaze finding Sarah. He gave a single deliberate nod, an unspoken instruction that was both a conclusion and a new beginning. The time for waiting was over. It was time. He stood in the quiet room, the air thick with the scent of old wood and unspoken history. For 30 years, he had carried the story of his abandonment like a shield, his righteous anger a constant companion. He had come seeking closure, a final piece to a puzzle, never imagining it would lead him back to the origin of his own deepest wound. Sarah took a deep, steadying breath, her gaze meeting his. The hardness he had seen in her before was gone, replaced by a profound, sad understanding that sent a tremor of unease through him. "My grandfather," she began, her voice low. "He wanted to be here for this." Her words hung in the still air as she looked toward the worn, leather-bound journal on the table between them. "That journal you've been seeing," she continued. "The drawings, the words, they're not Cody's." He frowned, confused. He'd studied those pages, seen the familiar artistic flourishes he'd mistakenly attributed to another. Sarah gestured towards her grandfather, whose weathered face was a mask of stoic grief. "It belonged to his daughter," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the final words. "My aunt, it was Lena's." The name, one he had not allowed himself to speak for 3 decades, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Lena. His Lena. The room seemed to tilt, the solid foundations of his life, built upon the bedrock of his grievance, crumbling into sand. The narrative that had defined his adulthood was beginning to unravel. Sarah's voice, now barely a whisper, sliced through his shock. "After your final argument, when you called her weak for her gentle heart, she didn't just vanish." The memory seared through him, vivid and shaming. Lena's face, her gentle eyes welling with tears as his cruel, arrogant words rained down on her. "She went home," Sarah said, delivering the devastatingly simple answer to a 30-year-old question. "To her people, to the reservation." It wasn't a mystery, it was a retreat, an escape not from love, but from his judgment. "She never stopped loving you," Sarah added, twisting the knife of regret that was now buried in his soul. "She just couldn't live with a man who saw her softness as a flaw." The truth was absolute. His primordial wound, the defining tragedy of his existence, was a lie. Worse, it was a lie he had carefully constructed himself. He was not the victim, he was the cause. She hadn't left him, he had pushed her away. The weight of it all pressed down, a suffocating 30-year burden of his own making. That revelation changed everything, and not for the better. Sheriff Miller, seeing his chance, twisted the narrative, painting the old man as unstable, a meddler in tribal affairs holding a sacred object hostage. He expertly fed the town's suspicion, and the community consumed the lie, their whispers turning to open scorn. Then the letter from the bank arrived, a final notice. The ranch he'd bled for was slipping through his fingers. His enemies were closing in, but the most dangerous one was the ghost in his own mirror. He saw his destructive pride in every escalating argument with Sarah, in every fence he'd built around his heart to shut out the truth. He told himself he was trying to hold on to Cody, but he was really just clinging to the last piece of a life built on a falsehood, and the entire rotten structure was collapsing down on top of him. Then came the day everything went dark. Swayed by Miller's arguments and the weight of the town's opinion, the court ordered Cody to be removed from his care. It was official. He stood on the porch, the foreclosure papers a cold weight in his hand, watching as Sarah's car drove away, taking the boy who represented his one shot at redemption. As the taillights vanished into the distance, the sky, a flat gray sheet all day, finally opened up. A sudden, unseasonable blizzard began to fall. The flakes, thick and wet, descended rapidly, burying his world in a definitive silence, a white shroud drawn over a lifetime of wrong choices. He had lost. He had nothing. He stumbled back inside the house, a profound cold seeping into his very bones, and sank into his chair. The silence that filled the room was more complete, more terrible than it had ever been before. Within the profound silence of the cold, dark house, a space now more mausoleum than home, he finally found the resolve to approach the table. Lena's journal lay there, a solitary object left behind in the wake of her absence, untouched for weeks. He had orbited it, his grief a tangible force field keeping him at a distance. He was unsure of his own intentions, uncertain what he hoped to gain from this confrontation with the past. Perhaps he sought no grand revelation, no cathartic release, but simply the tactile sensation of holding the last thing of hers he would ever touch, a final, physical anchor to a memory that was beginning to feel ethereal. His hand, hesitant at first, reached out and lifted the book. The cover was worn leather, its texture familiar beneath his fingertips, the corners softened by time and use. As he raised it, its weight a strange mix of comfort and sorrow. A single folded page that had been tucked deep within the spine dislodged itself. It did not fall so much as it fluttered, slipping from its hiding place with a delicate, almost deliberate slowness, pirouetting through the heavy air before coming to rest upon the dark, dusty floorboards. It landed without a sound, a pale square against the gloom. He knelt, his body moving with a stiffness that had little to do with the chill in the room. He picked up the page with a reverence reserved for the most fragile of relics. It was brittle, the paper yellowed and thin, and the central crease was worn almost to the point of separation, a testament to its having been folded and unfolded countless times. This was not a forgotten note, but a treasured, perhaps agonizing secret. The handwriting was Lena's, yet it was a stark departure from the elegant, confident script that filled the pages of her poetry. This writing was different, shakier, more vulnerable, the letters formed with a visible tremor. It was the script of someone writing years after she had left, a voice from a future he never knew she had. As if on cue, the wind outside began to howl, a low, mournful cry that rose in pitch until it sounded like a grieving animal pressing against the walls of the house. The sound filled the oppressive silence, a soundtrack to his own desolation, with hands that trembled slightly, mirroring the unsteadiness of the ink on the page. He carefully unfolded the brittle paper and began to read her final words to him. Within the letter lay the devastating revelation, a truth that recontextualized his entire life. Lena's words spoke of their son, Jacob, and the invisible wound he carried in his heart. It was a condition the father, in his pride and blindness, had refused to see, dismissing the boy's fatigue and quiet nature as a weakness, just as he had done with her. "I didn't take our son from you, my love," she had written. "I took him for you, so a part of you could live." The explanation was heart-wrenching. Jacob needed a quiet life, a gentle world that his father's tempestuous nature could never have provided. The rupture that had defined his bitterness for decades was not an act of betrayal. It was a desperate act of a mother's profound love. His breath caught, trapped in his throat as he read the final lines. Lena and Jacob had found their own definitive silence years ago, claimed by that very condition. Then came the final crushing piece of the puzzle. Cody, the boy he'd believed to be a random orphan under his care, was not random at all. He was Jacob's son, his grandson. In that moment, he understood. The silence that had long haunted the halls of his house wasn't an absence. It was a legacy. He grabbed his keys, the page clutched tightly in his fist. As he drove through the blinding storm, he faced a choice: revenge or forgiveness. A part of him, an old ghost from his past, yearned to walk into that town hall. It wanted to use Lena's words to utterly destroy Sheriff Miller, to bring shame upon the very town that had ridiculed him for so long. The desire felt justified. Suddenly, the truck slid on the icy road, and in that heart-stopping moment, he saw his entire life flash before him. A long, lonely road spent fighting all the wrong battles. He could continue down that path, keep fighting. Or he could finally stop. The image of Cody's face appeared in his mind, his grandson's silent, stormy eyes pleading with him. He realized he wasn't driving to confront Miller anymore. He was driving to find his grandson. When he finally pulled up to the town hall, its lights a faint, wavering beacon in the blizzard, he knew exactly what he had to do. He entered the sterile office, a stark contrast to the storm he carried both outside and within. Melting snow dripped from the hem of his heavy coat, forming a small, dark puddle on the polished floor, a testament to the world he had just left behind. His presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He paid no mind to Miller, the official behind the desk whose mouth hung agape in stunned silence. The old man's focus was singular, his gaze locked on Sarah as she poised a pen over the last of the paperwork that would finalize a great separation. With heavy, determined steps, he closed the distance between them. He said nothing, allowing the weighty silence to speak of the years of unspoken words. From an inner pocket, He produced a single sheet of paper, crumpled from the tight grip of his fist and stained with the ghost of tears shed in solitude. He offered it to her. Sarah's hand trembled as she took it, her signature forgotten, the pen hovering uselessly. Her eyes scanned the page, widening with each line, a choked sob catching in her throat as the truth of the words settled upon her. His gaze drifted past her, finding the small figure of his grandson, Cody. The boy watched him with wide, frightened eyes, and the old man felt a pang of profound regret, recognizing the fear as a shadow he himself had cast. It was a fear born of his own harshness, his rigid pride, and a long-held grief that had turned to stone. In that moment, a lifetime of stubbornness cracked. With a groan of protesting joints, he knelt, his proud knees bending for the first time in decades. The act was a surrender, an apology that words could not yet form. He leaned closer to Sarah, his voice a raw whisper, roughened by 30 years of disuse in matters of the heart. "He has his father's eyes," he breathed, the sound breaking, carrying the weight of a generation of sorrow. Then he turned his full attention to the boy. As he looked at his grandson, the image of his own failure, the ghost of the son he had misunderstood, began to fade. In its place, he saw not an ending, but a new, fragile beginning, a chance. He cleared his throat and began to speak, not with the voice of judgment the boy had always known, but with a new, softer tone. He told him a story, a true story, of his father's kindness, of a strength so deep and quiet you had to listen not with your ears, but with your heart to truly hear it. The fear in Cody's eyes slowly gave way to curiosity, and for the first time, grandfather and grandson began to build a bridge across the chasm of silence. The profound, oppressive silence that had long defined his existence has finally been broken. The ranch is gone too, a physical loss that has paradoxically led to a profound spiritual gain. He sees it clearly now. The sprawling property was never the meaningful legacy he had clung to, but merely a vast, lonely expanse of land that mirrored the emptiness within him. His world has now contracted and expanded all at once. He lives with Sarah and Cody on the reservation, in a modest house that radiates a warmth his former home could never muster. This palpable heat does not emanate from a hearth, but from the constant, life-affirming sound of voices and laughter, a symphony of connection that fills every small space and pushes back the shadows. One recent evening, with the Wyoming sky stretching above them like a dark, jeweled blanket, he found himself sharing a sacred piece of his past. He was teaching Cody, his grandson, the ancient Arapaho names for the stars, the same celestial vocabulary his beloved Lena had once taught him under this very canopy. The boy, who had been a quiet and watchful presence in his new life, finally broke the shared silence. Pointing a small finger toward a glittering cluster of distant suns, he asked, "What's that one called?" The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. It was the first real question the boy had ever asked him, a tentative hand reaching out across a generational divide, seeking knowledge and connection. As the old man met the boy's gaze, he was struck by the powerful lineage reflected there. He saw the deep, searching eyes of his own lost son and the resilient, untamable spirit of his wife, Lena, living on in this child. It was not a haunting, but a homecoming. In that moment, looking at the face of his grandson, he saw the tangible shape of a second chance, an unearned grace he never believed he deserved. A powerful realization, one that had been slowly dawning, finally crystallized in his mind. He has learned that a man's heart is not measured by the acres he commands or the material wealth he accumulates. Its true measure lies in the love he is finally brave enough and humble enough to let in. It was a truth that cost him a lifetime of loneliness to understand, but as he stood there beside the boy, sharing the stars, he knew the arduous journey had been worth every painful step. It had, against all odds, brought him home.